Thank you. It's great being here. It's a beautiful campus. As Dr. Rowlett said, I attended Florida State for my master's and my doctorate in clarinet performance, so I love coming back down to the South. Um, I am originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and like Dr. Rowlett said, I teach clarinet at West Liberty University. And I was so happy that he invited me to come and do this interview because I get to be with some of my favorite musicians and favorite friends. So I thought that I would just give a little bit of a summary of Dr. Mandat's music. And as Dr. Rowlett said, I chose Eric and his music as the subject of my doctoral dissertation because I love new music, but I really love his music. I remember the first time I was exposed to it by my professor at Florida State. I don't know, there was something about it. I loved the new sounds that I was able to make, and it was really it opened up a new world for me as far as the clarinet. So just to summarize, and it really is a summary because there's so many wonderful things about his music. He's really developed this new musical language for the clarinet, and there were others before that came up with certain, we call them extended techniques on the clarinet. So it's doing different physical things on the clarinet to get new sounds. But he's really developed, I think, a unique musical language where he takes these extended techniques that are unconventional and we don't normally hear in music, but he puts them in a musical context that is easy for us to grasp and easy for us to listen to. Because I'm sure some of you have maybe heard new music that's written around now that you're like, oh my goodness, I don't get this, it sounds sort of weird. But what he does is he uses traditional musical forms, so like ABA forms and sonata forms. And he also uses a lot of rhythmic patterns and repetitive rhythmic patterns that add these elements to the music that are easy to grasp. So while you're hearing these new sounds, there are other elements involved that help you sort of be able to know where you're going in the music. So you have the privilege of hearing him today and hearing him play a lot of his pieces. And I thought what we would do today is we'd talk a little about his background, what he's doing now, and talk a little bit about the pieces that he'll be playing today. So why don't we start with what you're doing now? So you're a professor of clarinet at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, and I was wondering if you could share with us what your duties are.
Well, I teach clarinet there, of course, and then I also teach graduate courses in musical analysis, and I've been doing that for a long time. I also have a great interest in analysis of music.
And how about performing and composing? What are you up to?
I continue to perform a lot of traditional music all the time. In fact, just 4 weeks ago, I did the Brahms Quintet down in Carbondale as part of a Chamber Music Society performance. And recently also did the Mozart Quintet not too long ago, and I enjoy that a whole lot. And I've been writing some. I just wrote another little book of clarinet etudes that will be coming out very soon, so I'm excited about that. And as performer, one of the new things that I've been working on the last several months really is I've been working with live electronics. There's a program called Ableton Live that I've been using, and I have another barrel with a pickup microphone that screws into the barrel that picks up a lot of the sounds and allows me to use my air in the ways that I've learned, and other aspects of my playing, just air sounds and finger sounds, to transfer into this electronics program to manipulate and color the sounds in new ways in real time. Then I've also been working with old Xbox Connect cameras to use my movement to help trigger and change aspects of the sound. So I'm dancing more in addition to playing. But it gives me just a new level of flexibility and new sound world to explore, and that's what I've been up to most recently.
You were exposed to music at an early age. You knew that you wanted to play the clarinet at 3 years old. I was wondering if you could share with us how you were exposed to music and who exposed you to it.
My mother was a amateur pianist. She enjoyed just playing for pleasure, and some of the earliest experiences I remember, just being barely old enough to stand up, I would watch her play the piano, and I would also see simultaneously the music on the page, and I just always remember how the notes looked like they were dancing on the page, and I thought that was so fascinating to see these interesting symbols up there and then to hear this sound that went with those. And so that was always fascinating to me. My older brother and I had records of different things, and one of them was the instruments of the orchestra, and we would pretend we were playing the various instruments of the orchestra. And when it came to the clarinet, I always had, just a wonderful time imitating that sound, with little blocks or something to be a pretend clarinet. And so we always had some kind of music around the house, and sometimes it was classical, sometimes it was other things, and we all enjoyed, listening and playing around to music and singing. So that was just part of what we did.
So you mentioned, with blocks and thinking of the clarinet, but what drew you to the clarinet?
I remember in the little record that I listened to, they said, it had such a great range and it could do so many different things, and it was just had like all of these possibilities to it, and I think that it excited me the most, the fact that it had a lot of, it wasn't like, they'd always say, oh, the bassoon is the clown of the orchestra, or they had like different things for each of the other instruments. But when it came to the clarinet, they said, the clarinet is like, it's like the queen of the orchestra, it can do anything. And so it was pretty cool.
You grew up outside of Denver, Colorado, and I was wondering if if growing up in that area has impacted your playing and your composing.
I think it has a lot. Just my feeling about music, it's so expansive of a landscape, and where my parents had a house was a really wonderful place to grow up. We had a kind of unobstructed view of the whole front range of the Rockies, so we could see, 70, 80, 90 miles of mountains out beyond us. And there's something about being in the middle of that every single day, and that expansiveness that just transfers into who you are a lot. And I think certainly in my playing, I've always tried to imagine that kind of broadness, just going out forever. And I think it's also influenced my composition in that there's this really interesting relationship between vast spaces and really small spaces, and I've always liked that. And you can go as deep as you can go and look out. You can also be that deep and look in. And a lot of the extended techniques require extremely subtle control of air and embouchure things, and it's a way for me to go inward just as expansively as I've gone outward in growing up in the mountains. So yeah, I think it's influenced a lot.
So one thing that I love about being a musician and an artist is meeting different people and learning about their backgrounds and the people that are part of their world. So we just talked about your surroundings and how that influenced you. So now we'll talk about the people that may have influenced your career. So you attended the University of North Texas for your bachelor's degree, and the University of North Texas is really known for encouraging their students to explore other aspects of music and styles of music. And can you share with us your experience at North Texas and how you feel that impacted you?
Sure. I went there thinking I was going to be a jazz major because I like jazz a lot, and it was, one of the biggest jazz schools, still is, in the country. And when I got there, there were 100 saxophone majors, and I didn't play saxophone all that well. And so I was like, well, I play clarinet a little bit better than saxophone. So I started getting more involved in clarinet. I always knew I wanted to be on stage, and the place was really huge, and there was so much going on, but there were actually not a lot of people playing for the composers, for their music and composer recitals. And it was a really handy way for me to be able to get on stage right away and to play their music, because they were always looking for performers to do their music. And then there was the added bonus of being able to build with the composer a piece kind of from scratch, and to kind of work collaboratively with somebody else to make something. When we're playing Brahms and Mozart and Debussy, we have a history of hundreds of recorded performances to check out and compare ourselves with and get inspired by, and that's really a wonderful thing. It's also a really wonderful thing to try and build something from scratch and have it feel like it's been played for 200 years like Mozart, and that was a really exciting part of what life at North Texas was for me. And so I spent a lot of time really getting to know different composers' works and learning how to build performances kind of from scratch.
So you went on to Yale for your master's degree, and from conversations we've had, you've had a different experience. There was a different environment. Can you share your time there?
Yale was kind of the exact opposite of North Texas. North Texas was giant size and very open, and you could kind of do what you wanted. Yale was very specific, a small program. It was about 150 master's students, and you were either a first-year student or a second-year student. That was it. There were just 2 years, and so there's a lot of turnover, and they had a lot of things they wanted all the students to get done, so there was a very set program, and all very valuable. But coming from a place where I had complete freedom to choose what I wanted to do, that first year at Yale was a bit of a surprise for me. And so I spent the first year trying to figure out ways that I could do things either, officially or kind of, subterraneously to help, continue to foster the individual things that I discovered. Yale was really great for lots of reasons. The players were all really wonderful, and there were, really many great experiences, educational experiences, cultural experiences in an environment like that. And the students, particularly the undergraduate students, were brilliant and well versed in every subject. And so it's like, I got a lot of deep exposure to many different kinds of art and culture through my time there.
You became a professor at Southern Illinois University, and then simultaneously began work on your doctorate at Eastman. And at Eastman, you studied with both Stanley Hasty and Charlie Nidick, that are just huge clarinet icons and legends, but very different, very different personalities, very different styles. So I was wondering if you can share with us your experience there.
Right. I studied for a couple of summers with Stanley Hasty before he retired. And then my last year, my full year at Eastman, was Charlie Nidick's first year teaching there. And the thing I got from Stanley Hasty was this great clarity and approach. I had been teaching. I was, teaching, and it was great to watch him in a teaching situation because he always dissected everything that was going on and put it into a series of little black and white question and answer things, and you would gradually build towards a deeper understanding of something through by saying, well, does it sound dark or does it sound light? Do your fingers move high or low? And like very specific things like that. And it really helped me focus on being clear in my own teaching and curious about why things work or don't work on the instrument in a very kind of technical way that I had been experiencing kind of intuitively, but not as highly organized as the way he approached everything. So that was really valuable for me. Charlie Neidig was almost exactly the opposite as a teacher. Highly intuitive. He would play a passage from some piece that I was working on, and he'd say, here, you can try it this way, and he'd play it. And so I would try it his way, and he says, yeah, that sounds pretty good, but maybe you should try it this way. And he would play the same passage completely differently, but still totally compelling, and it was just off the top of his head. And so I would try that, and he could come up with as many different interpretations for a phrase or a passage that, as many times as he played it, he could play it completely differently and compelling each time. And I found that very, very exciting. What it did to existing music, older music, was give it an incredible freshness, that it was okay to explore possibilities in pieces that have a lot of tradition and sometimes a lot of baggage associated with that tradition. And that was very freeing to me. And his whole approach to playing was that way. It's like, you want to just make the best statement you can. It doesn't have to be, follow somebody else's rules. And of course, by that time, I was a doctoral student, and my life was not so much about tonguing exercises or how far to move the fingers. It was really about how to express myself. But I think that's always a part of what we do, even when we have to go through the physical stuff, the little calisthenics and the muscle building things. We're still always, having to explore who we are in relationship to our instrument and what we want to say, that's going to excite other people, because that's the reason we're here in the first place as music majors. Somewhere along the line, somebody said, wow, you sound so beautiful. I really love the way you're playing. And then you say, oh, yeah, I like that. I like that feeling. I like being able to do that for other people. I'm going to major in music. And that's, what we all did. And I'm sure that's what you do as well. And so to continue to explore those things that you do really well that turn people on that's what it's all about for us, I think.
So moving away from your schooling, I thought we'd talk about one of the, I think, the very cool things that you do. So, although you do many cool things, but you're a member of the Tone Road Ramblers, and I was wondering if you could share with us what the group is, the members of the group, and what you guys do.
Tone Road Ramblers is an eclectic sextet of instrumentalists. The group started in the very early 80s, about 1980, as a collective of composers and performers who were students and faculty at the University of Illinois. I was not part of the group in those days in the early 80s. I've been with the group now since 1989, so that's like 26 years, which is a long time. The group's been together over 30, more like 35 years. But what they've done is they've explored improvisation, free improvisation. They've explored different kinds of open form compositions, mostly by various members in the group. And it's really a musical expression of personal friendships. Everybody in the group gets along in an unbelievably special way. We all have our own lives, but we have also this kind of collective value of each other in a very special way. And what ends up happening in our performances or in our improvisations is that it becomes like it comes like a musical version of our conversations when we're just hanging out and talking about stuff, and because we do a lot of that. That's a big part of what the group is about, just hanging around, telling stories, and just shooting the breeze, going around from one subject to another. And I think that's also a secret of what music is about, is this communication and connection feature. And through having open structure pieces or using improvisation, it allows us to access each other and our feelings in ways that aren't constricted by certain rules, and it allows us to empty egos in favor of something, a bigger picture that's starting to grow in front of us as we play. So that's just an amazing feature of what that group has been about. And as you can imagine, any chamber music group that's been together 30 years, there's a lot of things you can do together that you don't have to talk about. In the ways that we play, the ways that we understand each other, musically, in addition to personally, it's a very special feeling.
All right, so the $1,000,000 question: how would you describe your music and your composing style?
My music, it's actually maybe starting to change a little bit in style. I'm not sure about that, but I'm getting close to that, especially with the explorations of electronics. But I've always wanted to. When I first learned about extended techniques, I wanted to learn as much as I could, and I found a few pieces that were written by non-clarinetists, and they didn't quite, get, the how to integrate some of those sounds in a cohesive way, and so that inspired me to explore more and to try and compose more. And I have been interested a lot in composers who's had very colorful sound worlds. Modern composers, I liked George Crumb's music a lot. It was always very colorful and very clear, and high, in addition to being highly organized, and I'm into highly organized too, through my interest in analysis. And other composers, Georgi Ligeti has these really thick, kind of interesting textural pieces that are very colorful, and I was very drawn to those when I first started composing. I also liked the energy and the slow changes of a lot of minimalist music that I was hearing in the 70s when I was first starting to compose, Steve Reich and in particular. And so I followed a lot of those trends, compositional trends. Additionally, I've always loved the very visceral and direct music of traditional players in non-Western cultures, and not only wind players, but a lot of wind players. Japanese shakuhachi player, or Iranian ney player, or Armenian duduk player. Those sounds have just been really compelling to me. But all kinds of vocal and instrumental sounds from traditional cultures, because the rules are different. There aren't really rules in the same way that we think about them in our Western tradition. It's about getting a feeling across or having or being attached to some kind of important ritual, and a lot less about formalizing and extracting the music from life. And so while I continue to use a lot of those traditional Western formalized concepts, my deeper interest is in exploring those things which have more visceral connections to me and to audiences. So that's a combination of the technical and the aesthetic reasons for why I'm composing.
So, as I mentioned, Eric's performing his pieces on both the 1 o'clock and 7:30 recitals today. So, I thought what we'd do is go through the programs and we can talk a little bit about the pieces. There tend to be programmatic elements in your pieces, and the titles sort of hint at that. So, again, I thought we could sort of go through your programs and talk a little bit about the elements and maybe the extended techniques involved. So we'll start with Rouser.
Rouser. In your little booklets, you'll see it's spelled with 2 R's at the beginning, although in the booklet it's not, but there it is, Rouser. And the idea behind Rouser is multifaceted. The title, you can see, has kind of the concept of waking you up, rousing you up. Also has this sound sort of like a dog. You're talking to some old dog, you know. And so the basic concept of this piece is like some grouchy old dog that's just watching, snarls at passers-by as kind of the day unfolds. So that's the concept behind Rouser, and it just starts with a very small little theme that gradually builds up and goes crazy and crashes and burns, and that same little theme comes back a couple of other times, and then each time it's tweaked a little bit and then kind of rolls into other areas, but then always eventually comes back to that same little 3-note motive.
So both Rouser and Etude for Barney are smaller, shorter pieces that you've written, and they also include just some multiphonics, microtonal elements. So I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about Etude for Barney.
Yeah, Etude for Barney is not about the purple dinosaur, but it's about a friend of mine, colleague, composer Barney Childs, who taught for many years at the University of Redlands with another fabulous pioneer in clarinet extended techniques, Phil Rayfelt. And Rayfelt wrote a really important book on clarinet extended techniques in the 70s, and he revised it in the 90s, and he and I were very good friends for a long time. He actually interviewed for a clarinet position at North Texas while I was still a student there, and that's where I got to meet him. I played some music, new music for him, and he lived in Southern California, Redlands, California, which was not so far away from where my wife's parents were, and so when I would go back to visit them, I could also spend some time with Phil. But Barney Childs was this great composer and very eclectic personality. Pretty much anything that you would expect in a social situation or a musical situation, Barney was going to try and do the opposite. He was cantankerous. He probably took a bath once every 2 months. He was a heavy cigar smoker. He could be really, really crusty, but he was also beautifully poetic. He had been a Rhodes Scholar in England and was, you know, a brilliant personality. But he knew that fitting in was not part of what he was about. And so Etude for Barney plays a little bit with the idea of sounding, you know, very traditional, or setting up some expectations and then thwarting them continuously throughout this little tiny piece that is also focusing on a couple of specific fingering things for people to do.
Moon in My Window was a commission. Can you share a bit about that?
Sure. The Moon in My Window, which I wrote in 2007, was commissioned by a friend and colleague, Kelly Johnson, who teaches at the University of Central Arkansas. And she was doing an album called Child's Play, and she wanted to have pieces on there that had something to do with kids, because at the time her own son was like 5 years old. And so as I was thinking about it, I decided I would write a piece that kind of depicted a day in the life of a child. So each of the movements has something to do with a particular part of the day. Butterfly morning is waking up. You're It is, a game, playing tag. Then third movement, peanut butter, is lunchtime. The fourth movement was music box, maybe nap time. Fifth movement, all aboard, more playtime, yay. And and the sixth movement, which is the title of the whole piece, was The Moon in My Window, is based on one of my favorite children's books when I was growing up, Harold and the Purple Crayon. It was a great favorite of mine. Does anybody know that book? Yeah. Good. It was really popular when I was growing up. And the story is Harold has his purple crayon and he starts drawing a bunch of stuff and it comes to life for him, and he has these wonderful little adventures with things and picnics and all sorts of things. And then he gets tired and decides it's time, he better get home and figure out, but he got lost, he doesn't know where he is. So he draws a policeman to try and help him find his way, and the policeman's pointing the way he was going anyway. And so then he realizes, oh, wait a minute, my bedroom, has a window. So if I just draw a couple of windows, one of them's going to be my bedroom window, and I'll find my way home. So he starts drawing windows. None of them work. He draws a whole city full of windows. None of them are his. Then he realizes, oh yeah, the moon is in my window. And so then he finally draws a window with a moon in it, and then it becomes his room, and then he draws his bed, draws up the covers, and falls asleep. And it's a really beautiful story, and so that was what I was thinking about as I was writing that piece.
All right, and finally, Chiral Symmetries is your most recent solo.
Yeah, it's a big, long solo piece. I'm going to do a couple of movements tonight from that. In the program book, the movements themselves, I must have forgotten to send the exact names of the movements, but there are 6 movements in the piece, and I'll be doing 3 of them. The first movement will be called Stars Twinkle, Planets Shine. The fourth movement is Origins, and the 6th movement is called The Universe Stops Expanding Briefly to Offer Advice. And one of the things about chirality, I don't know if you know this term or not, but it's a particular type of mirror symmetry in which things seem to be identical, map onto each other, yet they're not. Like a pair of shoes is the perfect example of a chiral kind of symmetry. They're matched, they're mirror images of each other, but you can't put one shoe on top of the other and have them perfectly match. It's kind of the same way with a pair of hands or any of those kinds of things. And there are a lot of things in the natural world that are like that, that have these really interesting features. And so a lot of the aspects of the music, the structure of the music, the titles to some extent, and just the way I was thinking when I was composing this have to do with this question of how things seem the same but are maybe not quite, or things that appear to be identical are in fact exactly the opposite. And it's a very interesting kind of phenomenon. So that's what that piece is about. It is, the whole piece is very long. It's maybe like 25 minutes long. And what I'm doing now with this piece is I'm gradually turning it into a concert-length performance and interspersing between the movements of chiral symmetries improvisations using these electronic things that I've been developing to, as kind of commentary, each of the movements comments on the other. So there'd be some written movement and then an improvised movement. And the idea is to create this sort of full concert length kind of immersive approach that will be, the written out music will then subsequently be amplified, and the sound will be moving, you know, throughout the room, throughout the speakers, in addition to the improvised music, which I'll have that capability of through the connected cameras and the other aspects of the software that I'll be working with. So that's chiral symmetries a bit.
So the final two pieces, I thought we'd play a little bit of them to give you guys an idea of what you'll hear today. So Preludes, which is actually one of the pieces that I focused on in my doctoral treatise, is in several short movements. And one thing that I love about Eric's composition style is that I think especially in this piece, the extended techniques that you use are mostly organized in a way that are never so overwhelming that the player feels like they have so many extended technique things coming at them at once as the performer, let alone the listener. So I think in this piece in particular, you just do a really wonderful job of presenting the extended techniques in very musical ways, but also it's never too overwhelming for the performer and the listener. So the first movement, and again, there are programmatic titles. The first movement is entitled Illinois Central, and was inspired by a train that would always come through town in Carbondale. And so in this movement, you use multiphonics to create that sort of chugging sound of a train. So I was hoping maybe you could play a little bit, maybe explain to us you know, how you're creating the sound. So multiphonic is when two or more pitches are simultaneously sounded on the clarinet. And you can achieve this in different ways. So you can use normal traditional fingerings on the clarinet and you just overblow or underblow the notes to get the two or more sounding pitches. Or you can use unconventional fingering, so it's sort of, you know, I think, again, playing a lot of your music, the fingering sort of carry through, you know, and you become familiar with, you know, seeing a multiphonic and know that that's the fingering to use. But I would think there's just some experimentation that goes on to figure out how to sound the certain pitches that you want at the same time. So these are unconventional fingerings that, you know, like I said, are sometimes discovered through experimentation that produce those two or more pitches at the same time.
Yes, I'll expand on that. That's a really great description. I'll expand on that just a little bit. The clarinet has, like every other instrument, has a whole range of overtones attached to the primary sound that you hear. And those overtones are what, and the relative strength of those overtones are what make a clarinet sound like a clarinet and not like a flute. And so they're present in the sound, but just not oftentimes really overtly audible. And so playing multiphonics just helps make those things overtly audible. When we first learn playing the clarinet, band director gives you the instrument and says, all right, got the reed on. Now, if you don't put any fingers down, you're going to get open G. And so, you know, the kid's like, yeah, all right, I'm going to try that. I'm going to make a big... That's the first sound that comes out. And the band director says, well, that's not right. You're going to have to, like, change a little bit and make sure that doesn't happen. So eventually you get to there. And then later you start learning the second register and you're feeling pretty good about adding more notes to it. And then you start going up higher. And that happens, band director says, you know, that's not quite right. And then so, you know, they tell you all the things that you need to do with your air and embouchure to sort of avoid that so you can sound great. But in the meantime, like our two earliest experiences with playing the clarinet are multiphonics experiences, and then we are like spend the rest of our lives trying to avoid those. And I've spent most of the rest of my life trying to explore them, and because I was such a good squeaker, I was good at squeaking, and so that's what I've been doing. There's a thing that I call the highest open hole rule, and this is like critical for understanding any kind of playing issues, anything that we have where we're kind of struggling with the instrument. And basically what the highest open hole rule says is the closer your highest open hole gets to whatever your register hole is, the more that register hole doesn't want to function as a register hole, but wants to just drop down into the low register. That's why as we start climbing up that second register, we get that grunt sound. Stanley Hasty always used to call it the grunt. And he never just said, you've got the grunt. He always made this face when he did it, and you really felt badly. It's like, you've got the grunt. So you really wanted to fix it. But the grunt is simply that. And by being able to hold your embouchure and your air steady, there they are. Both notes are sitting right there. That's the instrument wanting to break down into the low register because your highest open hole is so close to that register hole. We encounter the same thing when we get into the altissimo register. That becomes our new register key there. It's too low and it's too big. They've tried to make it smaller. You can see how much smaller it is than all the rest of the holes, but it's still too big. So we have two options. We either, in order to make those sounds good, we either try to make the hole a little smaller, or else we want to try and put it higher up on the instrument, farther away from the highest open hole. Many of the notes in this next register, the altissimo, are not so bad for us to play. C sharp, D, E flat, even E is not bad, but F, and then especially like this short F sharp is so hard for us to play. That's because that highest open hole is so close to the register hole. And if we're not really in a good place, we get, and we can't get that note very well. So we have two options. We can make the hole a little smaller, then it's going to function a little better. I'm not really doing anything different. Or we can put that hole way up high. By putting the hole farther away from the highest open hole, now the register key is doing its job as a register key and it's kicking the note up higher. That's the whole principle behind the highest open hole rule, and it's the whole principle behind multiphonics. So when you understand where you are with your highest open hole relative to whatever the register hole is, then you know how to make the slight adjustments downward or upward to help keep both notes going. And it's a pretty easy exercise. This high C is really a beautiful balanced note to practice getting both notes at the same time. And then you can kind of gradually sneak down chromatically and feel how that changes for us to be able to try and hold both those notes, the things we have to do. And so it's just really a matter of learning those things. And there are several different categories of multiphonics. Each one has their own little quirks. This first movement of preludes, the Illinois Central, and by the way, the titles of preludes are in the program for the evening. So you'll see those titles, and I'll tell you about that. It's just not attached to the word preludes. So the train whistle, the train would go through Carbondale right about the time where the slow movement of a traditional sonata would show up in recital. And so everybody would be, things would get quiet and the person would be ready to play. And the train would go through town. It was really a beautiful thing. So I thought about writing a little bit of counterpoint for it. And so here's the idea. it uses a particular category of multiphonic that combines like a long second register note or third partial note like C with a very short note like A. So the A gets lowered because I've added all these extra holes. But also because I'm adding all these extra holes and they eventually get very far away from these holes here, these holes start functioning as register holes too. So they give me this very interesting kind of close interval multiphonic. It sounds a little bit like a train whistle. So I'll play just like first phrase or so of this. So that's part of the tune there. That's the idea behind Illinois Central.
So moving on for time's sake, I thought maybe we'd go to the fourth movement to talk about microtones and quarter tones. So in this movement, it's entitled Spin Moves, and it was inspired by an NBA playoff game and just the balletic grace of the basketball players. So in this movement, you use a repetitive rhythmic figure to create cohesiveness throughout the movement. But you also utilize some microtone and quarter tone pitches, and I was wondering if you could share with us what those are and how we sound them.
Sure. These are all fingered pitches. The clarinet is actually very good at being able to finger pretty consistently in tune quarter tones rather than sort of like double the number of notes. And there are many other possibilities in between those. But those are all easily fingerable and they sound pretty similar. They have similar resistance characteristics to the rest of the instrument. So in spin moves, the idea was this combination of this very graceful sort of thing and the kind of super strong, athleticism that basketball players have.
Very cool. So it sort of blurs the tonality of things, right? So the last thing will be, I'm sure all of you have noticed this little contraption down next to him. So this PVC pipe extension is used in the second movement of Double Life, which was written to honor William O. Smith, who really is in a lot of ways like a founding father of multiphonics and some of these extended techniques. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit about the background of the piece and what the different movements mean and why they were written, and then tell us about this pipe extension.
Sure. William O. Smith is indeed kind of like the founding father of extended techniques in this kind of classical music context. He's a clarinetist, composer, lives in Seattle. He taught for many years at the University of Washington. He's nearing 90 years old, but he's still an amazing player. He came out about 2 years ago and performed and did a whole week with us during our New Music Festival. And he's just amazing. He, in the very early 60s, was the first one to actually systematically catalog all these multiphonics and attach fingerings and note names, and he really understands the instrument in a very special way. Also, he's incredibly creative, nonstop thinking about new things to do. with the instrument. And while he's not actually done this kind of thing, I've seen other people do it, and it's sort of his way of thinking. He just is always looking for ways to make the clarinet sound interesting. And he was also a very renowned jazz player. He played for many, many years with Dave Brubeck. He and Brubeck were part of they formed a group together back when they were graduate students at Mills College in Oakland, long time ago, like in the 40s. And so I wrote this piece because there was a special tribute to him at one of the clarinet fests in Vancouver in 2007. And so I wanted to try to write all the things that were, that I felt from him, and everything he does always inspires. This movement with this is called Deep Thoughts, and the last movement that I'll be playing tonight is also called To Be Continued, and his work has always inspired deep thoughts from me about how to explore the instrument more, and my sentiment is that his energy is going to be continued. So I'll show you a little bit about what this does. All this does, by attaching this part to the end of the instrument, obviously gives you a few more notes to play that you're going to have to access with a leg. Okay, so you got a couple more notes down there at the bottom. And then one more note that gives me like a low A. So at different points in this piece, I'll access these notes. Additionally, because there's this extra length of tube, if I kind of just wiggle on these holes, it'll change the sound a little bit. Sort of like what we recognized if we play a note and wiggle one of the low keys, we get this sort of shift in sound, and the same thing happens here. That idea. And so this piece really just moves through and gradually sort of adds these couple of holes, and then finally at the very end adds the very bottom. So you'll get to see that tonight.
Well, I think that's about it. I don't know, we don't have much time, but I don't know if anyone has any questions. No? Well, I'm sure you're going to be really in for a big treat today. It's always a pleasure to hear Eric play, and I think especially for him to be playing his own pieces is certainly a big treat. So you're going to hear some really new, great sounds, and hopefully it just sort of opens your mind to the possibilities of what our instrument can do, and just help you get a little bit more familiar with Eric's music and just how wonderful it is and what a special clarinetist and musician he is. So thank you for having us, and we'll probably see some of you maybe at the next masterclass.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much. Thanks.